All right. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. You are here at Supporting Your Own Path and Recovery while supporting family members in theirs. This is a webinar presented by the CAFÉ TA Center, facilitated by our friends Kirsten Drybro and Charlotte Armstrong, who I will introduce you to in just a few minutes. Before I do that, I'm going to do our usual webinar housekeeping, tell you a little about who we are and what we do, for those of you who aren't familiar. So we are the CAFÉ TA Center, and we're housed in a nonprofit organization here in Tallahassee, Florida, called the Family Cafe. We've been around since 1998, serving people with all types of disabilities, both here in Florida and across the country. And one of the things we do here is try to bring the various disability communities together. So serving the mental health community is an important part of that mission. And the main way we do that is through our CAFÉ TA Center, which is a SAMHSA-funded consumer and consumer-supported technical assistance center for mental health. That's a little bit of a mouthful, but I will tell you what it means. Basically, SAMHSA, which is, of course, the federal agency dealing with behavioral health, has all kinds of technical assistance centers and programs. Many of them are either clinical in focus or are academic based. What makes the TA centers like ours unique is that this is by and for people with lived experience of mental health conditions. So we're part of a group of 5 TA centers that are operated either by people with mental health conditions or people that have direct relationships in their family units to people with serious mental health conditions. And that's where the consumer supporter label comes in. Like all good TA centers, of course, we have a website at cafetatacenter.net. A few things to know about that. First of all, you can find all of our programming there, recordings of all our previous webinars, all of our newsletters, resources, training modules, one of which we'll be talking about later in today's presentation. It can be found there at cafetatacenter.net. That's also where you can go to join our mailing list, which I certainly encourage you to do. It's a great way to stay in touch with us. And perhaps most importantly, that's where you will find the recording of today's webinar. It'll be right there in 2 places. One, the article that's about this webinar itself. That registration link will be a recording link afterwards. And also on the page that says TAC trainings, where we list recordings of everything we've done here at the TA Center throughout this grant cycle. It'll be up there as well. So it'll be easy to find. If you have any trouble finding it, just let me know. A couple other small housekeeping things. A couple people emailed ahead of time to ask about certificates of attendance. Those are certainly available. If you'd like to get one, just send me an email and I'll get one to you. So that's who we are and what we do here at CAFÉ TAC. My name, of course, as I already told you, I think, is Jeremy Countryman. I'm the program director here at the TA Center. Joining me today is John Ferrone, our training coordinator. So one of the things that we like to do here at the TA Center, and kind of fits in with the idea that this is by and for people with mental health conditions, people in direct relationships to them. This is really about a nothing about us without us sort of effort. And it's not meant to be the sort of thing where we lecture at you and you just sit there passively. It's intended to be as interactive as we can make it within the bounds of what Zoom lets us do. So as we go along, we encourage you to share questions and comments. You can either put stuff in the chat there in Zoom, or you can also use the Zoom Q&A function, assuming it still exists since they updated it. And that's a good way to share any thoughts, comments, questions you have as we go along. The reason I'm mentioning that now is because John and I will be keeping track of all that stuff as we go along. So we're trying to make sure anything that comes up in the chat gets addressed in the conversation, and Charlotte and Kirsten have a chance to talk about it. Because again, we want this to be relevant to you and your daily experience, and we want to be responsive to what you think is important. So with that, it's now my great pleasure to introduce Kirsten and Charlotte, and I'm going to hand it over to them. And I'll just be here in the background, keeping track of all of your feedback as we go along. So welcome, Kirsten and Charlotte.
Thanks, Jeremy. Kirsten and I always love hanging out with you and John and supporting families. And we hope that all of you who are logging in, I saw someone from Canada, someone from Ohio. Welcome, everyone. My name, like Jeremy said, is Charlotte Armstrong. I'm a family peer supporter, and I also train family peer support, the people who want to become family peer supporters. So my day job is working, training peer supporters, but my give back and my passion is really supporting families on their mental health journey. And I'd like to say I'm a mother of two resilient daughters who are living in wellness as defined by them. And they're happily on this road trip across the United States right now. And I'm getting updates daily, which really excites me. Because there was a time in my story and my family's story that I wouldn't have thought that this was possible. And Kirsten and I will share a little bit as we go along in our story. But Kirsten, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Charlotte. And thank you, Jeremy and John, for having us. Like Charlotte said, we love hanging out with you guys and working with families. I'm a family peer supporter as well. And my day job is also training family peer supporters. So you're going to hear a lot about both Charlotte and my own story as the next hour moves through and as we share with you. But I'm also happy to say that I'm a mother of a 23, almost 24-year-old young woman who today lives in wellness with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So, like Charlotte, I didn't think that I would ever come to a place where I would be relaxed, I could sleep at night, and my daughter is actually taking ownership of her health, both physical and mental health, which really was the game changer. And through that journey, you're going to hear a little bit of my own story today. I learned a lot about my daughter, myself, but I also learned a lot about the family and the family mental health story and the roles we all play, especially myself. And having said that, I think we'll just move right on, Charlotte. What do you think?
I think so. Jeremy, the next slide, please.
So this definition, family peer support, I'm just going to share it with you. Family peer support is the instrumental social and informational support provided from one parent to another in an effort to reduce isolation, shame, and blame, to assist parents in navigating systems, and provide other relevant life experiences. So going back in time, I actually created a culture of secrecy within my own home and my own family when things first started to go sideways, when my daughter was about 11 years old. I had no idea what family peer support was. All I wholeheartedly believed was, as the years slowly moved forward, that if my daughter wasn't thriving, I was failing as a parent. And and what was happening with her health was on me. Again, a lot of isolation, shame, blame, very common for family members. I want to just talk about that word family before we move on. A couple of definitions I want to share. First off, family, when we use that word, family to you is whatever family is to you is what it is to us. We're not holding that to a traditional model or a blood relation. We understand that if you have somebody in your circle that you consider family, that's exactly who we're speaking to and of when we use that word family. There's family of origin, family of choice. And also, I want to talk about that word child. So we're going to use that word often over the next hour. And, a child is anyone in your circle, anyone in your identified family that you feel you have a parental role with. So again, there's no traditional model we're holding that to. And a child can be honestly 14 or 44 or 64. So there's no age limit on that either. So just to clarify that, I think that's really important as we move forward. Charlotte, is there anything you wanted to add here?
And in that SAMHSA definition, it talks about parents and how we define family peer support is thinking about that caregiver. So it could be a best friend, a coworker, whoever you feel that's your family and you're supporting. And So I often think that we need to write our own definition, Jeremy, that just encapsulates, everybody, just not the parent. I think we're ready for the next slide. So we talk about the parallel process. And for us, what does that mean? It means, when one person in the family is struggling, it impacts every member of the family. But it also means that, we each bring our own mental health story, our own stuff to that collective family. And we're going to start to talk about what do we mean by the family's mental health story. But again, I always like to say it's not fair that we put all the focus on the one who's struggling the most. And what do I mean by that? Well, we all have our mental health that we bring to the family. We're all working on our things. And sometimes I remember back when my daughter was struggling the most, I wasn't taking the best care of myself. I was so focused on what was happening for her. And I wish if I could go back, I would have taken a little bit better care of myself so that those days when it was really, really hard, I had a little bit more in my toolbox to support me as I was supporting her. Anything to add, Kirsten, on that?
Yeah, well, I'm a big believer in the parallel process. And, the parallel process, when we speak to that, and we will speak to that often, what I wish I knew going back in time, and both Charlotte and I, the work we do is often we think about the conversation we would have had, the us of today with the us of years back, right? And I really wish that I would have understood the parallel process, embraced that with the understanding that my daughter was not the one in our family that needed to do all the heavy lifting, needed to lean into all of the change, that we were all playing a role in what was happening in our family mental health story. And I sure wish I could have self-reflected on the role that I was playing. But again, I was very unaware of that at that time. So I hope this speaks to all of you. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it as we move along.
So Jeremy, if you go to the next slide where we've got the objectives, what we're going to talk about in the next hour. So, the first point we want to start to dive into is what do we mean by this mental health continuum? And what do we mean by the family's mental health story? And I think of, we all have mental health, we all have physical health, and it's on a continuum from, we have some good days to where, everything's falling apart. And, I like that visual. The wheels have fallen off the bus and we're like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do. But when I think back, when my daughter was first struggling, she was choosing coping strategies at the time that I would have labeled as bad or unhealthy. And she got that label of, a bad kid, and I reached out to, teachers and counselors and my family, trying to make sense of what was happening in my family's, in her life. And, I think back of, all the different advices that I was given and how that played out in the days and weeks and months that came to be. She was labeled, this is a typical teenage angst, to, this could be a serious mental health issue. And how did I support myself as I journeyed through that? Kirsten, you want to take the second point?
You bet. We're going to explore the family's mental health journey as individuals and the impact of personal influences within the recovery story. So, we talk all the time about the family mental health journey, the family mental health story. We all bring our personal influences, our past experiences. I know I brought my past experience of things that happened in my own home when I was younger to my current family mental health story. So if we can start identifying that, and we will talk more about this, we're just touching on it. But if we can start identifying our biases, what we bring in as individuals to the family mental health story, it is going to really aid as we lean into the recovery story. That's why we're here today. We're talking about the recovery story. And I'm going to leave it at that because I don't want to go on too much. Charlotte?
And then we're going to start to talk about some, actionable strategies to support and understand each members of our family's recovery through the stages of change. But first off, we're going to have you take a look at what stages of change look like for you and your recovery story. Jeremy?
Well, I always get a little excited when I see this definition. This is a definition that going back in time really, really spoke to me and was a bit of a pivotal moment about 9 years ago in my family's mental health story. I'm just going to share it with you. It's put out by the Mental Health Commission of Canada. The idea of recovery, this is, by the way, this is the family recovery definition. I need to share that first. The idea of recovery is approached from a slightly different perspective. The family member strives to recover from the emotional turmoil, grief, and/or fatigue that may result from caring for someone with a mental health challenge or illness. The family member's path to their own mental wellness, we're going to be talking about that, or recovery, is likely to be enhanced by a better understanding of their loved one's illness and through the development of more effective coping skills. Greater confidence, accepting the situation, and having hope, that's another big one, for their loved one will help them be more effective caregivers and supporters, while also helping them to sustain their own well-being. We refer to this as having achieved a level of readiness. And I'm just going to take another minute to talk a little bit more about this family recovery definition. First off, when I first found this definition back in time, it was a huge aha moment because I really stopped and reflected for the first time that, wait, I have some recovery to do on my own wellness. In this definition, it talks about the emotional turmoil, grief, and/or fatigue. Well, the chronic stress that I was under as a caregiver and as a family member with a daughter that was really struggling for years was really taking its toll on me. I had lost for what I thought our life as a family was going to look like, especially for my daughter and all of us involved. And the fatigue had really started to wear on my own physical wellness. And this definition, for the first time in a long time, gave me permission to be, it let me know that it was okay not to be okay. It gave me permission to say, yes, you know what? I'm not okay. I think I need some help. And yeah, anyways, maybe I'll leave it at that because Charlotte, as you know, I love this definition. I have it in the wall of my office. And I use this as I support families in their family journey. And yeah, we matter too. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and it's something that we matter too. And if we can come together as families to support one another on our own mental health story, or our own recovery, our own wellness, however that you define it, I always say we got a better shot at supporting our family member. Jeremy, you're going to go to the next slide, please.
So what do we mean when we say the mental health and physical health are on a continuum? I have to be completely honest. I never thought of mental health being on a continuum. I never reflected on mental health when my children were a lot younger, or even put any attention on how's their mental health doing right now. Again, this is going back about 20 years. But it took me far too long to understand that mental health and physical health are on a continuum, and they both equally really, really play a part in your wellness. Sure, I understood that physical health went up and down. You could break a leg, get a virus, God forbid. Some people have disease, and their physical health gets greatly impacted, and they go to that really low end of the continuum. Of course, we need to eat well, sleep, take care of our bodies, nurture our bodies and our, for that physical health to be at optimum. That I understood. Why? I'm not sure why, but I had no grasp on mental health being on a continuum. So I took it for granted that mental health was optimum. Why wouldn't it be unless something really tragic happened? You know, I took it for granted. I never made the connection as a parent that it had to be nurtured. Our sleep mattered. Our physical activity really mattered. You know, our nutrition, the stress, our mental health affects our wellness as a whole. And I sure wish I would have had that in check going back in time. It would have been really helpful when things started to go sideways. Charlotte, did you want to add?
You know, and I often think about that, you know, your daughter has her diagnosis, and my daughter has, you know, her challenges too. And when we think of the mental health on a continuum, it's not always about their diagnosis. They can have days where life's throwing a curveball at them, and it has nothing to do with their diagnosis. It just has to do with life. And I think you and I goofed on that, because often when our daughters had poor days with their mental health, we immediately jumped that it was something to do with their diagnosis that they had. So I often think of that too when I think of the continuum.
And that's a practice, right? You and I both kind of check in with each other because life is bumpy. And we often have conversations with each other to kind of get checked in, because you're right, that umbrella of the diagnosis, sometimes we sweep a whole lot underneath that umbrella.
Yeah. But I wanted to put it back to me because I too, like Kirsten, didn't want to talk about this mental health on a continuum, because I was so focused on what was happening with my daughter and her struggles. And if I could go back in time and look at, I was really struggling. I was scared. I was living in a fear-based mode. I had migraines all the time. I had that nervous stomach and went everywhere with a jar of Tums to try to calm it down. But I would have told you, I am fine. I've got this. It's not about me. It's about my daughter. And so, if I could talk to the me of 15, 20 years ago, I don't know if I could have gotten through to that stubborn person, but I sure would have, hoped that hearing what we're saying may have resonated with the stubborn me back then. Jeremy, you want to go to the next slide, please? So Kirsten, you and I have been talking about this family's mental health story. And so I just wanted to start to talk about it to everybody, who's joining us today. And, I come from a family of 4. I've got 2 daughters and a husband, and each of us bring our mental health story to that collective family. So, I've mentioned my daughter's, living in wellness as defined by her, what does that mean? Well, she's got her own recovery story. She's got her own wellness, and she's got what she's working on. And that goes for her sister too, and my husband as well as me. But what I want to talk about is how we come into the family, and we have our own lived experiences. We have maybe some traumas that we're bringing to the family. We have culture, we have community. And so the me who came into this family when I got married, I came from a family that shoved everything under the rug. We didn't talk about anything. Both my parents struggled with alcoholism. So the me used to dance around to make sure everybody was happy. And I wasn't good at boundaries. And so I start to think of, what I brought into the family and what did I need to work on. So as my daughters struggled, my pleasing and my dancing around really, really started to increase, because that's what I knew best. And it probably wasn't the best choices for her back then. And that's when I started to think about, how could I start to change things about me to better serve the rest of the people in my family. Because the one thing you and I have learned, Kirsten, is the only person we can change, no matter how hard we try, is ourselves. Kirsten?
100%. Yeah, Charlotte, if I could have willed recovering wellness on my daughter and served it to her back in time, it would have happened. That's how hard I worked at it. And you're right. The only, I had I did a presentation the other day, and this just comes into play here, and it was to about 200 teachers up here in Canada. And one of the teachers really pushed me in the Q&A to ask me about, when is the hump? When do you see the hump and you feel like things are going to start to change on the other side? And this particular teacher, I got the sense, was speaking for his own family story. And that hump, when things start to change, that's when I started to look at my own health, how fractured I was, how I was showing up. And I wasn't a whole person or well when I was trying to show up for the rest of my family. That hump was all about me. Can you relate, Charlotte? Of course. And there was nothing magical. There was no magic wand. That hump was me taking a pause, reflecting on my own wellness, being intentional with how I wanted to show up, getting my own anxiety in check, and not just doing the same dance with my daughter over and over again. The predictable, she would do A, I would do B, and then we'd come to C. And that's what I really want to get across when we talk about the family mental health story here today is I'm hoping everybody starts to really look at the individual roles that we all play, and not only looking at the individual roles, but really reflecting on the only change that we really can create is with our own action. Did you want to add a little more, Charlotte?
I think we'll just keep moving on.
Okay.
The next slide, please.
Well, that kind of was a segue to this slide. Understanding the individual journey and the part we play. I'd like to just open it up to see if anyone is struggling with this concept that we all play a role in the family mental health story. Just briefly in the chat, I'm just going to stick to this one question because we're going to save questions for the end. But before we move on and really dive a little deeper into our own recovery, and the recovery of our family, I just want to make sure that everybody is grasping what we're sharing. I think we're good, Charlotte.
Yeah, there have been a couple of things that have come up in the chat, but everybody seems to be
Good.
on the same page. Keeping track of a couple of questions we'll bring up later that we can talk about. But yeah, I think what you're getting at is coming through for sure.
Awesome. Excellent.
And also, since I'm jumping in, I just want to say real quick, because I forgot at the beginning, at the end of the webinar, we're going to have an extended Q&A period. So there'll be plenty of chance to go more into this and talk about people's individual questions about their relationships they have going on for them once we get to that point. So if you want to get into something like that, hang on, we're going to get there.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay. Sorry, I'm just looking in the chat. There's a few questions that Charlotte and I often put forth when we're working with families and in a few different presentations, webinars that we have done. Did you want to share them, or did you want me to continue, Charlotte?
I'll start with the first one. It's, what is your idea of recovery? And some people call it wellness or well-being. But I want you to think about, how do you define recovery for the person you're supporting?
Hey, Charlotte, what if someone asked you that question going back in time, what would your answer have been?
Well, I don't know if you all heard how I defined, when I said to my daughter was living in wellness as defined by her, and that's her taking ownership of her mental health. But back in the day, I wanted her recovery to look like this, back in school, and not only back in school, back on the honor roll, choosing healthier coping strategies, getting rid of some of her, her friends that I didn't agree with. I wanted her to quit smoking. I wanted her to be that child that when she was born, that fit the dream that I had for her. And that wasn't how she was defining recovery back then. Lots of conflict. And one of the things that I regret is never having that conversation with her back then on how she defined what she wanted for her recovery. I was so focused on telling her what I thought she needed. You want to take the next one, Kirsten?
Correct. And that brings us to question 2. Does your idea of your person's recovery align with theirs? And have you ever had this conversation? And this is a question that typically when we put it out there, I'd say it's about 50-50. Half the families we work with really haven't had that conversation, especially if the child is, under 20. But, understanding what their idea of recovery looks like is so pivotal in how you're going to show up and support that individual. Going back in time, my idea of recovery certainly did not align with my daughter's idea of recovery, and I certainly never asked that question. Again, that's a little bit about the conversation of the me of today would have had with the me of a number of years back would have been really, really helpful.
And the last question we're going to ask you is, can you be in a place of recovery even if the person that you're supporting is not? So I want you to think about that. And Kirsten, I like to share that one of our slogans is, bumpy is good, because we are going to have those ups and downs in our family's mental health story. And if we have had a chance to work on our tools of supporting ourselves, we have a better shot of getting through those times, when it's a little bumpy.
And we have a better shot of supporting not only ourselves and the individual, but our entire family. Going back in time, absolutely, the deterioration of our own wellness, I was not showing up the way I wish I could have. And that plays a part in the family mental health story as a whole, 100%.
Jeremy, we're going to go to the next slide. So we've put up this slide, and it's called, it's a stages of change model. And in the inside of it is the clinical definitions of these different stages. And we've added some more, common wording, or as we call it, more pure language, in order to start to understand what this might look like in your world. And stages of change is not always about mental health. It's about any time we're making a change in our life, and these are some of the stages that we may or may not go through. And for some people, you may go through them quickly. Some people may go through them slowly. Again, it's very personalized to you and the change that you're wanting to make. And for this webinar, and on this slide, I want you to start to think about a change in your life. And I'm going to talk of a story of the me who wanted to start to take care of herself. And what did that look like? So the pre-contemplation, I'm not aware of a change. So when I talked about when my daughter was struggling the most, I was popping Tums, had a nervous stomach, and I would have told you, I'm good, I'm fine, I got this. And I didn't. So then I started to think about, maybe I need to start taking better care of myself. What does that look like? So my friends were all saying, well, why don't you, exercise? Because that might help. So I started to think about, okay, maybe exercise. Should I go to the gym, yoga, meditation? What does that look like for me? So I'm just thinking about it. And then you start to go into, okay, I'm ready for a change and a plan. So I Googled hot yoga. That seemed to be a fit. And I started to do it. And I became going every day, became part of my routine. And then I fell out of yoga. So some may call that a relapse. But what happened for me was yoga wasn't serving me anymore. And I took up walking and hiking with my dog. That fed my soul, really supported my mental health. So walking my dog became my maintenance. And that's kind of what I do every day. Now, the reason we wanted to share this with you is if we can start to identify areas in our life that we may want to start to think about how we can change something in ourselves to better support us as we support our family member. I encourage you to start to think about where you're at in those stages of change. And then, yes, you can start to think about where your family members are at in their stages of change on what they're wanting to change. Do you want to add something to that, Kristen?
Yes, and thank you, Charlotte. I think you added it all, but I often think when we use this slide, I think one day we need to take a slide and take a pen to how our route actually went through these stages, because there would be no straight, clean lines. This would look like a tangled ball of yarn. And one of the things that I wish I knew back in time, first of all, you and your family members can enter and leave these stages, bounce across, fall off, come back in at any time. And that's realistically the way it rolls. When the relapse happened, my legs would just be taken out from under me if my daughter was experiencing a relapse with her behaviors and choices. And I wish back in time I could see the relapse. I wish back in time I could have nurtured my own wellness to a place where I was whole, and I could see a relapse as more of an opportunity and more of something that eventually is typical in most of our stories. The change, the lessons learned, opportunity to reconnect. Not a bad thing as we label it. I just wanted to point that out. Going back in time, I'll tell a quick story. My daughter was in a treatment facility, and it was time, just a few weeks before she was being discharged to come home. And we were sitting in a family group, and the therapist at that time for this group was asking all the girls what they were most fearful of with leaving and going home and getting on with life. And they were all afraid of messing up, screwing up, doing something they shouldn't. And then this therapist also, after went around the room, said, well, I want you to just let that fear go, because it's going to happen to every single one of you. No one's going to be perfect. And I remember as a parent at that time thinking, what are you talking about? What do you mean? We put all this work in for months and months. But that was the first time that concept was shared with me. And it's something that we should not be so fearful. Or I shouldn't tell you, I don't mean to shit on you, but it's something that I wish in my family story I wasn't so fearful of. And I recognized it as an opportunity for some growth as well.
And circle back as well to, supporting our daughters as they were going through stages of change on different ways that they wanted to support themselves. So I remember, my daughter thinking, I want to try this now. And everything inside of me was like, oh, I don't think this is going to work. And I wish that I could have gone back and supported her resilience to take a chance to see if that was a fit for her, and not just expecting that relapse was going to show up and see, I told you so. Because that often was what my messaging was to her. Why did you even try when I knew this was going to happen? Because it really was about allowing. When I say allowing, I really wanted to nurture her resilience and her taking ownership of her mental health and trying something different. Because when she started to try things different, she found what worked for her. Like I said in the beginning, she's living in wellness now, and I didn't think she'd make it into her 20s. I really didn't. Next slide.
And
go ahead, Kristen.
I'm just going to briefly add that word messaging, our messaging, right? That's something that I just want to take a moment and talk about. Those are our actions, how we're intending to show up as a supporter. And I encourage you all to really look at the messaging behind your actions, because like Charlotte shared, the messaging that was coming across through her actions at that time, and I can certainly speak for myself, as well. I wish I was a little more self-reflective, and I could have really, really been more intentional if my own recovery, my own wellness was more whole. I hope that makes sense, right? About that messaging.
Next slide, Jeremy. So we want it, this is another, again, this is just another tool for you to start to think about where your family is at. And, you know, for us, like the stages of change, we start to think about where we're at in our family's story. And Kirsten, you're going to start this one off, and I think I'm finishing.
You bet. I'm going to speak to this one a little bit with my own family story as well. So when we look at the top, you know, that suspicion that, you know, is something wrong when you first are having those spidey senses, and your gut saying, you know, something just feels off balance with my daughter, and I'm starting to see kind of some darkness was creeping in. I encourage that that spidey sense, that gut is so powerful. I hope we never stop listening to that. And that's what we're talking about with the first point up here. Moving on, that diagnosis. Well, that diagnosis, whether it was something that you know, a self-diagnosis or self-identifying with within your home, or putting that diagnosis. You know, I think my spouse is depressed. I think my child or my sibling is depressed. That's what we're talking about here. And if we can just take some time to think about how that's showing up. I know back in time when we moved on to the adjustments, I got kind of caught on the diagnosis because I was pretty sure that if I worked really, really hard and I found the correct diagnosis, that I could get her in front of the right team of people who would then fix the diagnosis. And then we could get on with life as we had planned and I had always expected it to be. That didn't happen in my family story. I went on to the adjustment, and that's when you start to think about, okay, we need to adjust our lives. We need to adjust how we show up for each other in this home. We need to start making some adjustments within our family. And with those adjustments, you know, we talk about that grief that happened in the family mental health story. That kind of crept into my own story at that time. And yeah, I'll let you continue on here.
You know, and so when we start to think about, and thanks, Kristen, that management stage, and this is where we tend to go either enabler or, you know, or that advocate role. And so what do I mean by that? You know, are we supporting our family member to look at their own wellness and define their own recovery? Or are we just, you know, doing for them? Are we stepping into that role where if they do this, we do this, you know, like that dance that Kristen and I were talking about. And again, the only person we can change is ourselves, no matter how much we want to start to will it to change for our family member. But I know I hung out in this management stage with my upset stomach, with all that fear that something was really terrible going to happen. And I proudly was that enabler. I did whatever she needed at that moment to get through that moment. I was her whatever she needed. Wasn't doing great at work, wasn't doing great with my friends, but that's just where I was at. And then this purposeful coping. That's when I started to take a look at my own well-being, my own wellness, and started to make changes for myself. I also started to give the message that you've got this, Sarah. You can do this. I know you have the tools within you. And I really started to support her on her journey. Now I'm telling you that it wasn't all easy. Bumpy is good through this purposeful coping, but that's when I took ownership of my own mental health, my own physical health. And she was watching change with me. And so were my other family members. They're like, what's going on with you? And I was like, you know what? I got to take ownership and make some changes within myself. So what happened next was she did take ownership of herself. And the house that we had bought, where we thought she was going to live with us forever, she announced one day that she was moving. Couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I had to sit in my discomfort and support her on that. And she ended up moving out of our city. And then she ended up moving out of our country. But she's living in wellness. Again, I'm going to say, as defined by her. Is it what I dreamed of for her? No, not even close. But it's her life and it's her mental health. And again, this is just a tool that we can think about where we're at and where we can make change for ourselves as we support our family member. Because I know for me, when I took ownership and started to make change for me, the rest of my family noticed. And some of them joined in and started to make change for themselves. And we started to talk about mental health more and where everybody was at. And it's joking, in the center of this family diagram, I have a red line, because from that we created what we call the red table talk. And yes, it was taken from a podcast, but it's a place when we say we're having a red table meeting, it is a place where our family can come together and have a conversation where no one is going to be judging them. And it's a safe place for us to talk about hard things. Could I have done that 15 years ago? Nope. Do I celebrate what we can do now? Yeah. And it took me a lot of hard work, as well as my family coming together and working on themselves. Kirsten, did you want to add? I think you've got an example you wanted to share with something we work on all the time.
Okay, give me a hint.
The DoorDash story.
Oh, the DoorDash. Of course, of course. So that's a really good example. So this is something that comes in the work that we do more often than not. And this is a good example of going through some of the stages of how we can make change around a situation with our family. So we find with family members, especially parents, often a young adult, a male young adult, the problem occurs that they're in my basement, they're not working, and they're ordering DoorDash all the time. So I want my son to stop gaming, and I want him to stop ordering DoorDash. So what are the things that we can do as parents in this situation? Well, we cannot change our son's actions or as much as we want to, or as much as we will do, but we can change our own actions and look at how we show up and how we may be a part of enabling some of these decisions. So ask yourself whose credit card is in one family. This mom never really stopped to think about how, yeah, that is my credit card he's using to order DoorDash. So there's one thing you can change by removing your access to your credit card. Ask yourself, does your son pay rent? Is that something you've discussed as a family? Well, maybe that's something that can happen so that he needs to go out and get a job, or he doesn't have the funds to keep ordering DoorDash. He needs to think of how life's going to work so he pays rent. In one situation, that's not how it went. That son actually decided to move to some place else where he could get free rent. And that wasn't a bad thing either, right? That wasn't a bad thing. So again, just looking at how we can impact what's happening within our home, not by putting restrictions and hardcore boundaries around the individual's behaviors, but actually kind of looking at our own behaviors and how we're contributing and making changes for how we're showing up in that role as a supporter.
This is one of the things that Kirsten and I love working with families, is when they want to start looking at some change that they can make. And it's just a really awesome place to be when you hang out with peer supporters. So someone with lived experience. So we're not going to tell you what to do, but we're going to support you to start to explore what that change may look like for you.
Hey, what about the gourd story, Charlotte? That's a good one too.
You know, we've been working with a family, and he's allowed us to share this story, and they came to us because they have a son who was really struggling with his mental health. And as we started to work with him, the dad and the mom, you know, we kept saying, let's talk about what's happening for you, what's happening for your wife. We weren't focusing so much on the son at that point, because we were really trying to support, you know, what was happening for them. And a couple of weeks in, he came back to Kirsten and I, and he looked at us. He says, I can't believe this. I have something I have to share. This isn't all about my son. This is about me too. And when he had that realization, he started to work on himself. And what a change we started to see in that family.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Can I interject a quick question that somebody brought up in the Q&A? Can you give a definition of what purposeful coping is? I know you kind of talked about it a bit, but if somebody said just what is purposeful coping in a nutshell, how would you define it?
So thanks for that, Jeremy. So when I put coping, if I just left it as coping for me was Tums, Zantac, upset stomach, migraines, and I was just coping through the moment to support my child. When we added that word purposeful, it was starting to take a look at how you're coping. Are there areas that you would like to change that better suit your wellness, your well-being? So purposeful coping went from Tums and Zantac to walking my dog, to working with a family peer supporter. So looking at ways that coping may serve your mental health in a place that's not just, you know, popping Tums and Zantac. So I can't define it for you. I can only define it for myself. But coping back then was not taking care of myself. It was getting through the moment. And coping for me now looks a whole bunch different.
So it's more sort of thoughtful, intentional decisions about what you're going to do to cope and maintain your self-care, as opposed to just, you know, default coping, like I can't deal with this anymore, and you'll act out in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Gotcha.
so if purposeful is not resonating with you, my hope is you change it to what does. I think we're ready for the next. Oh, there you go. Thanks, Jeremy.
So my hope is that you take some time, and we're going back to these questions that we've asked already. But our hope is you take some time after our webinar and really kind of chew on these questions and how they show up in your own world. What is your idea of recovery for the person you're supporting? Really encourage you, if you haven't thought about this, think about connecting with the person you're supporting and having a conversation about what they think their recovery looks like. Does your idea,
you know, and oh, sorry, Kirsten. And then thinking of the stages of change, and maybe you can identify where they're at. Can you change your conversation a little bit differently, meeting them where they're at? I didn't mean to interrupt, but I often think when we tie in these recovery questions and thinking about the stages of change, we can change our conversation a little differently. You go to the second one, Kirsten.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just I love that phrase, meeting them where they're at. And I encourage you to look at the stages of change and think about how you can meet all of your family members where they are at, because you may be in different places. The second one, does your idea of your person's recovery align with theirs? Again, we talked about having this conversation. You know, it's something that's so valuable in your role as a supporter, and for you to show up as that positive supporter. And you know, this is a conversation that I think is going to be really hard for you to show up as a positive supporter if you do not have this conversation. The last one is, can you be in a place of recovery even if the person you are supporting is not? And this, out of the three, is the one that we find most controversial, or comes up, gets chewed on the most within the groups that we work with. And I can answer it for myself. And yes, I can be in a place of recovery because I have my own path of recovery that I need to walk within my family mental health story. It took me a really, really long time to grasp that. And it's still sometimes it's a hard practice to maintain, especially when things get difficult within our home, because it's not perfect. But I have come to realize that I can be in a place of recovery, even if my daughter is not, if that makes sense. It's a tough question. Charlotte, can I ask you that question? Can you be in a place of recovery even if the person you are supporting is not?
And I can say yes, and it still takes some work when life gets a little bit hard. And we're going to start to talk about this in the next bit after we get into the Q&A. It's thinking about that purposeful coping, or however you define it. Do I have tools in my toolbox to support myself when life gets a little bit hard?
Yeah.
And I think we're just going to move to the last slide, and then we're going to start that Q&A because I know we're at the top of the hour. Kristen and I always love to share this slide and the one that follows. And Kirsten, I know you wanted to start this one off.
Yeah, I love this slide. We have our own recovery and our own path. I spoke briefly about that family recovery definition speaks to it. It's a path that when I did start to recognize my own recovery, that I knew I could only walk it alone, and I had to do the work on myself. Charlotte.
And the second one, we have the right to feel safe in our own home. So starting to take a look at that.
We have the right to say no. And I can tell you, going back in time, I would have to take a big breath if I was about to say no, because that could end up in a really eruption in my home. But I want to remind you all that we have the right to say no, as hard as it is at times.
And this one was a hard one for me. We have the right to our own boundaries. Like I, told you earlier on, boundaries were hard for me. And I do have the right to have my own. And we all have our rights. Kristen?
We have the right to our own support system. Again, I spoke about that culture of isolation and the shame and blame that can happen with family members. We have the right to our own support systems, our own family support. I encourage you to really, really lean into this one.
And the final, we have the right to not fix, save, and solve, but instead support, our family members' empowerment and their own recovery story, however that looks for them. This one is one that Kristen and I were born fixer, saver, solvers. And this is one that we work really hard on. But once we stop trying to fix, trying to save, and trying to solve, but in support the empowerment of our child, that's when we started to see them take ownership of their own recovery story.
And one of the things, I just want to touch on that last one too, people often use the word rescuing, and we talk about the messaging. Charlotte, did you want to speak a little bit to the messaging that would come when we would go into our roles of fix, saving, and solving?
Yeah, so that, fix, saving, and solving, or some people use rescuing. So when we would swoop in and try to save them, the message that our daughters were getting was, we don't have the tools to do it ourselves. Mom's got to come in here and do all the heavy lifting. And they started to believe that that was not possible for them. And once we started to change that narrative, that they had the power within themselves to find what they needed to support themselves, it was a game changer.
That's the one I sure wish I learned a lot earlier.
Jeremy, and then our final slide, and then we're going to start into our Q&A. Give ourselves grace. You know, self-care is not selfish. And our self-care is a gift we could give ourselves and our entire family. And my favorite one is we do the best we can with the tools we have. And when we know better, we do better. But most off is we matter too. So Jeremy, I think we're ready for a Q&A. So I know there's some questions. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry, you wanted to go here. My apologies.
Yeah, just real quick, because I know some people only had an hour available, so I want to touch on these couple things before I do any questions. First of all, on a TA Center website, there's a set of modules that Charlotte and Kirsten developed for us that are available in that same place. You can find a link to it on that TAC training page. The Supports for Family series, it talks about a lot of the things we talked about today, and it talks about stuff beyond that. There's a set of 5 modules. Each one's accompanied by a video. You can kind of return to it, do it in a self-paced way, download the whole thing, jump around. But that's all available on our website. So this is a topic that, if this is a topic that's of interest to you, you want to know more, please do go check that out. One other thing I wanted to tell you about is that we have a little bit of funding set aside to allow Kirsten and Charlotte to do individual support with people. So if after today's webinar and our Q&A conversation, if you'd like to have a chat with either of them about things that are going on in your own personal situation and do that one-on-one, we do have the ability to provide that to you. So all you would have to do is reach out to either Kirsten or Charlotte directly, or if you want, you can reach out to me and I can help you coordinate all that. But we would love it for people to take advantage of that, because, you know, where do you get free one-on-one support? It's not something you come across very often that's readily available. So if you're interested, please do check that out. Okay. So those are my 2 little plugs for some of the extra things we have going on. Now let's talk about questions. So I wrote down some as we went along. And I'm going to go in no particular order. The other thing is, I just like to remind everybody, and I know a couple of people have done it already, if you want to put something in that Q&A function, which apparently Zoom still does have, they just moved where it is, but I found it, or just put something in the chat for us to bring up, we can certainly, you know, address things that way. So the first question is, this is kind of a simple one, but an important one, because a couple of people asked it. How do you become a family peer supporter? And I know this changes based on where you are. So I had one person specifically asked about, oh, you know, how does this work in Canada? You know, how does it work in the United States? I know it's different in every state, which makes the answer more complicated. But if somebody thought, oh, this is a really cool thing, and this is something I'd like to get involved with, where would they start, and how does that process kind of work?
You know, great question, and thank you whoever put that out there. I was just 2 weeks ago at a conference in Oregon. It was called Peer Apocalypse, and there was about 1,000 peer supporters there, and 5 family peer supporters out of the 1,000. That's all we were. So it's a growing field. I'm always excited when families and people wanted to join on the family mental health side, family peer support side. Jeremy's right, it's different in every state. And if you're having difficulty finding information in your state, please reach out to me, because I work in many states across many different states. And I think I might be able to find the answer depending on what state you're in. And if it's not available, that's where that advocacy piece comes up. You know, start to share, hey, we need family peer support too. Because the more of us who start to talk about it, the more it's going to become a growing profession. Like Kirsten and I do this full time. We love our job. And I know of several family peer supporters who love their job too, and it's a career.
Cool. So yeah, that's, I'm glad that came up too. And I think I would also add, oftentimes, depending on what state you're in, there's a specific agency that will be charged with all the peer support stuff. And for those of you who are familiar with the way peer support works in different places, for example, Florida has a certification for youth, a certification for family, and a certification for veterans. So there are some states will have a specific family certification. There's others that don't. But in most cases, there's a state agency who has, jurisdiction over the whole peer support certification process. So if you kind of don't know where to start, figure out who does the human service stuff in your state and look on their website or call them. And that's probably a good place to begin. Okay, so here's some other questions that are a little bit more getting at the heart of the content of what we're talking about. And I think this is a good one. Somebody asked about whether or not this applies to sibling relationships. And, I think, and it also makes me think about there are all kinds of different relationships where you have somebody who's in some sense a caregiver and another person who is dealing with some type of behavioral health challenge. And obviously, when it's your traditional parent-child relationship, that kind of informs the dynamic. You expect, especially, a household with biological children, okay, the parents are going to be making decisions and the children are going to be, either staying within the bounds of those or not. And that's kind of going to set the tenor of how everything happens. What about other types of relationships, specifically this one? Like, what about a sibling relationship where there's one sibling with a behavioral health issue and another who is sort of ended up in that managing or caretaking role? How does that work? Is it a lot different than the parent-child kind of relationships? Are the borders different? Or is the decision-making process different? How does this work if you're dealing with people who are, don't have that parent-child dynamic and have a sibling dynamic?
I can answer that one, Charlotte. And I know what Charlotte's going to say because it's exactly what I'm going to say. 100%.
You must work together.
Yes, 100%. This has crossover to any relationship that you consider family. And we do talk about, Jeremy, our own experience an awful lot. And in both of our stories, it's a parent-child experience. But all of this certainly would apply in a sibling relationship, in a spouse relationship. It's all true to how all of it, especially to the idea that that caregiver stress, that how it impacts our daily life when we're caring for somebody within our family unit, especially if they live under your roof. It all 100%. It's very, very similar. Every relationship is slightly different, but the concept of everything we share, 100%. Yeah.
You know what? I was thinking of this one. It's a brother supporting his sister, and he had a separate family, and trying to manage his relationship with his sister and while still supporting his wife and his young family, and it was impacting his mental health a lot. He was living in fear that if he didn't do for his sister, she would choose something that he was fearful of while maintaining his family. And so when we started to work with him and support him on how he was going to manage his different hats that he was wearing, those different roles, and what we did see was him taking ownership of himself, working on his boundaries, and changing his narrative with his sister, because she was so used to him doing for her that that's all she ever thought, that he was going to do whatever she needed. And so that little bit of change in what he started to do and allowing her to start to empower herself, it was a huge change. And then we got to meet his mom. Do you remember? Then we got the mom coming. So it was a totally different dynamic we started to support the mom in that story because she was worried about her son and her daughter. So we supported her to look at areas where she could change and support her wellness. So that was a real fun family that we worked, and they were with us for about a year. They used to go to a group that Kristen and I facilitate. And then they said, thank you. And I think we just get updates every once in a while. So yes, Kristen's and my experiences with our children, but the skills transfer to anyone who just calls themselves a family, supporting whoever in their family.
Yeah.
There was a question in the Q&A. I typed a quick response, but I think it would be good for you to respond to it. Person was basically saying that her child was in the emergency room and probably going to be in the hospital for a little bit, right at the moment when her bills are due for her rent. And parents thinking, am I enabling my child if I pay the rent bill, and is that a bad thing? Kind of summarizing the exact question. But just in general, if you can kind of talk about the idea of kind of choosing the right time for whether you want to call it tough love or giving yourself permission to let go or that kind of stuff. I mean, sometimes in the middle of a crisis may or may not be the right time, but if you guys can talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, this has come up in the past as well. And, I'd like to speak to the fact that in this story that you're sharing, John, this is a mother and a child. And we are still allowed to mother. We're still allowed to be kind and supportive as a mother. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're enabling. However, we're also fearful of falling into that enabling lane, right? So, and this is something that only your gut will have to answer. But we still are allowed to mother our children. We're still allowed to be kind and show up. Is what we're doing allowing our child to remain in destructive patterns of behavior? That's a good question. I ask myself that at times. Charlotte, did you want to weigh in?
We can't tell you if it's right or wrong for your family. And everybody is different. So that emergency, John, what you were sharing, the me would probably pay the rent. I'm just saying me personally, but the me of today would also have a conversation when life was a little quieter of how that would look going forward too.
That's exactly what I typed.
Oh, I didn't.
Same wavelength. All right.
And like I said, we don't have all the answers. We're not going to give you all the answers. We're going to support you to find the answers within you that works for you as you support your family member.
Here's another question that goes back to the one, I think it's kind of related to the sibling issue, but it's a little bit another level of complexity. What happens in a family dynamic or, a family of choice dynamic when there's multiple people in the caregiving role and they don't agree about the path forward or, what needs to be done? Like, for example, one wants to be very strict and say, oh, we're going to have, a bunch of boundaries around how this person's allowed to behave and whatever. And the other person's saying, we're going to let them, explore what recovery means for them and give them more autonomy, just as as one example. But generally, when you have some level of disagreement or conflict in a family unit with multiple caregivers, how do you manage that complexity? I know, not an easy question. I'm sure one that's different every time you run across it, but any thoughts would be helpful.
I jokingly said I'd love it if they would come to a group, because you're meeting people at different stages of change where they all are having they're defining recovery for their family member, each of them have their own definition. And so when we start to have conversations of what that looks like in a safe and non-judgmental place, that's often when you're going to see change with the other family members. It's hard if they're making these choices and I'm going to say staying in a bubble. You know, this is what we've always done. You don't agree with me, I'm going to do this and that. It's just when you can start to expand your horizon and start to see how other families are doing it. So and I'm going to go back to the only person we can change is ourselves. And so, yeah, my daughter's dad and I had very different opinions on how we wanted to parent her. And a lot of that stemmed from his upbringing. He wanted a hard and fast line on, you know, toughen up and, you know, you just got to soldier through. And I was a little bit wishy-washy on my boundaries. And so you had that hard and fast and then the wishy-washy and we disagreed the entire time, and the impact it had on our daughter was tremendous, because she knew if she went to one, she would get this result. If she went to the other, she would get this result. And it wasn't until we started to really take a look at, were we serving this best for her? Was this the best for her recovery story? And that didn't happen until we started to meet other people who had gone through something similar and start to have those conversations without judgment, and start to explore, is this actually working for our family, or is it causing more disconnection? Kristen, do you want to add?
Yeah, I'd like to add Charlotte's story is a little different to mine. My husband, in my family story, my husband and I were very much on the same page. However, my older daughter absolutely got dragged into the role of a caregiver, and that had a really negative impact on my own family story, in the sense that I wish, going back in time, my daughter, who was, 19, 20, 21 at the time, my older daughter, I wish my messaging to her was, hey, you know what? Your dad and I've got this. This isn't your burden, and I don't want you to worry about this. We're doing the parenting. I just want you to take care of yourself. That wasn't my messaging. I really dragged her in. I asked her opinion, her advice. Again, we had this kind of cone of shame and blame that we didn't want anyone else to know about back then. So, I want to look at the stages of change for all the family members and how they are all impacted. And looking back in time, because of my own fractured wellness, I leaned really hard on my oldest daughter. And I wish I could have changed that. And we talk about that quite openly now. And I did get to a point where I did make a change. But the resentment that happened within herself towards her sibling was something that she continues to work on keeping in check. So there's lots of facets to that.
But our role as a family peer supporter is to listen to anybody who in that family who wants to chat with us too. So the one who has this one way of doing it, the one who has the other way. And our job isn't to tell them what to do, but to support them to see how their actions are playing into that family mental health story. And is it best serving the entire family, or are there places that you want to make change? Like the Gord story, when we go back to, he had his way of parenting. This was the way. And then when he started to make change for himself, it was an amazing story we watched, as their family. Does their son still struggle with his mental health? Absolutely. Is life bumpy for them? Yeah. But he's got a lot more ways of supporting himself now to get through those hard bits.
This is a question that came up earlier in the chat when you were doing your presentation. And I feel like it's sort of in some ways related to the question about what happens when there's disagreement in the family unit if there's multiple caregivers. But maybe it adds another layer of complexity, which is this. The person who made the comment in the chat was talking about the fact that they keep running up against different family members' traumas and sort of mental health triggers in the process of trying to work through supporting the recovery of the one person that's kind of the focus in the family that has, you know, the pressing SMI or diagnosis or what have you. I'm just curious, first of all, is that common? Like, do you see things, like people will get into this and they'll think, oh, this is just about person X who has diagnosis Y and they're the issue and we're going to figure out how to worry about their issue. And then you get into that and start peeling that apart, and then you start to realize, oh, this caregiver has this trauma and this sibling has this other trauma and the other caregiver has this trauma, and all these things are kind of, you know, setting each other off and creating all kinds of places where they bump up against each other and it becomes really messy. I'm kind of curious if that's a common thing in family peer support, because, you know, you start peeling the onion and all kinds of stuff gets discovered. And then, of course, the second half of that is, how does one manage that? Like, do you have to, I know we talk about a parallel process, and the context in which we were talking about it earlier was like, oh, the caregiver has to think about their own wellness and their self-care while the person with the mental health condition is working on their recovery, and you can be in different places and you can go at different speeds. And that seems like sufficiently complicated. What happens when you have, you know, 3, 4, 5 people that all have different parallel things going on and they're all in different places? You kind of have to have one conversation about the family as a unit and then 4 or 5 different individual conversations about what's going on with each person, or like, do you take turns who you're focusing on, or the different people have to go off and, you know, get to a certain point individually before they come back together and work as a unit? How do you kind of manage that kind of dynamic when it gets that complex and everybody has that number of things going on?
I'm going to say come to group, but Charlotte can add on to that.
It seems like the universal answer.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting in families. I remember early on in my daughter's story, and I was reaching out to my parents and my aunts and uncles, and everybody had an opinion on what kind of treatment or supports my child needed. And it was all through that lens of whatever their past experiences was and what they thought was best for her. And I remember some were very adamant that she needs to go to this, she needs to do this, and there was no place for conversation, and it caused a huge amount of discourse in my family, and at one point a lot of family members were telling people that my head was in the sand, and, you know, I didn't know what I was doing, and, you know, I needed help too. And the reason I bring it up is because that caused even more of me feeling like I was on an island, more shame and blame. And when I started to hang out with family peer supporters, like families who were going through something similar, and I could share, you know, some people think she should do this, some people should think they should do this. They allowed me a place where they weren't telling me what to do, but allowing me to start to support where my head was at and where I was going. And I know people on the line are saying, no, I want actual tangibles of how to manage my husband and my kids and this, and they're all coming at me. But again, if you can start to support yourself so that you can in turn with confidence say, this is what I need for myself, and this is what I need to do to support my family. Because I was bouncing around with different treatments and trying this and doing that, because the pleaser in me wanted to please everybody in my family and try. And all along I wasn't listening to what my daughter was asking for either. Kirsten, do you want to add?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Jeremy. And as far as the role of a family peer supporter, coming to group, listening to folks open up and talk about their own family situations, we often encourage, a sibling or a mom and dad, like bring grandma and grandpa, bring the uncle if they feel like they really want to be a positive part of that family mental health story. Absolutely. And you see a lot of things transpire on group just organically, which are such great lessons for all to see. But there was a time in my own family story where my parents, they had a really hard time watching myself be in a lot of pain and discomfort over what was going on with my daughter. And I know this was with the best of intentions, but they started to really insert themselves and have conversations that were more harmful than good with my daughter, with the best of intentions, but it's a different generation. And, a good strong kick in the ass sometimes is what they felt needed to happen. So I did for myself, it didn't go over well, but I asked my parents to please stick to the role of grandparent and let me stick to the role of parenting. And they had their nose pretty out of joint. They came around, but it took a few weeks. But for myself, that's something that supported me as I was trying to show up for my daughter. Yeah.
And then I just finally, Jeremy, in some cases, if two family members come to talk with Kirsten or myself, and they're very much at a different place, and they want one-on-one peer support, we end up doing them separately so that each family member can be heard and supported, instead of trying to play that, whatever you want to call it. Like, I can't support one and the other when they're arguing. Mediator is the word I was looking for. So
Right.
often in those cases, we end up working separately. And then if there's a point where they want to come together and have a conversation of how they can come united and go forward, Kirsten and I would, if we were invited, would go with the one we were supporting at the time and support that conversation. But we never get into that role where we're trying to manage two personalities coming at each other.
Right. Cool.
Hey, and I'm looking in the chat and I'm seeing how it's a couple of comments about how families can be so critical. Come hang out with some family peer workers. Like that's, I encourage everybody to connect with family peer workers. Sometimes that's exactly what we need instead of all the critics outside of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because the most important word in family peer support is probably support, and that I guess the kind of dynamic you're talking about where you have people, competing and arguing and what have you is exactly what we're trying to diffuse when we're doing peer support, because we want everybody to be heard and validated and feel like what they're saying is being taken in by everybody else in the room. So I'm glad you made that point. Okay, well, there's pretty much all the questions have been addressed now. So first of all, I just want to remind everybody, hey, if there's something you think we should be addressing, please do reach out to us. I know this is just a cute slide that says stay in touch with us, but the point is we actually do want you to stay in touch with us. And the more feedback we get about what you want to be talking about and learning about, the better for us. So don't hesitate. And then I'm going to put this one up again. This has Kirsten and Charlotte's email addresses. I know it's kind of a pain in Zoom. It won't let you copy and paste stuff from it exactly. Although I think John did figure out how to do it from the chat earlier. But just remember, if you miss something, you're like, oh, how do I find that person? Just reach out to us, CAFÉ TA Center at gmail.com. You can go to the CAFÉ TA Center website and get to us that way. So if you miss copying an email address, don't worry, reach out. I'll help you out. And along those same lines, of course, you're going to be able to find a recording of this on our website. It's going to be both in the article about this webinar and in the TAC trainings page. And I'm going to get that put up there this afternoon before I go home. So again, I just want to thank Charlotte and Kirsten so much for their time with us today. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having us, Jeremy, and nice seeing you, John. Thanks for having us. Always an honor and a privilege to spend time with you all, and reach out, all of you out there. Kirsten and I are always happy to have a conversation.
Yeah, as I said
Yeah.
earlier, that one-on-one time is available. So please, if you'd like to, do take advantage of it. I also saw one person in the chat just asked about the slides. If you'd like a copy of the slides, just email me and I'll send you one. That's no problem. I'll turn it into a PDF, so it'll be easy to send out to people.
Jeremy, is the are the slides available on the website when this gets posted as a recording, as well as like a separate PDF?
No, but in this case, because so many people asked for it, I'll probably put it up there.
Okay.
I just have to turn it into a thing and create a link for it. So I'll do that as well to make it easy. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. And we'll hope to see you again soon. Have a great day.
Thank you. Stay well.
Yeah.